They called her the most beautiful queen of the 7 kingdoms. But the villagers who saw Elisara from the castle windows noticed something strange. She didn't seem to age. For 40 years, her skin remained as smooth as porcelain. Her hair as black as midnight. The price of this beauty was written in blood on the stones of Crimsonmere. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background, and let's begin our journey together tonight. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Crimsonmere Castle like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their hold on the fortress that had dominated the Drachenwald Valley for 3 centuries. From the village below, the castle appeared as a dark silhouette against the pewter sky, its towers piercing the clouds like accusing fingers pointed toward heaven. The peasants who worked the fields in its shadow had grown accustomed to its brooding presence. Yet there was something about their mistress that unsettled them in ways they could never quite articulate. Queen Elisara von Drachenwald had ruled these lands for 40 years, and in all that time, she had remained as beautiful as the day she first arrived as a young bride. The villagers remembered their father speaking of her ethereal beauty, and now their own children gazed upon the same flawless face that seemed untouched by time's relentless march. Her skin remained as smooth as polished marble. Her raven black hair cascaded down her shoulders without a single strand of silver, and her emerald eyes held the same piercing intensity that had captivated kings and nobles throughout the realm. It was this agelessness that first sparked whispers in the market squares and taverns of Thornwick Village. Old Henrik, whose weathered hands bore the testimony of 7 decades of toil, would shake his grizzled head whenever the queen's name was mentioned. He had served in her father's household as a young man and remembered when Elisara was barely 16, fresh-faced and innocent. Now, as he approached his 80th year, she appeared no older than she had been in those distant days of his youth. The castle itself seemed to reflect its mistress's unnatural preservation. Where other strongholds showed signs of age-crumbling mortar, moss-covered stones, ironwork rusted by countless seasons, Crimsonmere remained pristine. Its walls gleamed like polished obsidian, and the banners that flew from its towers never seemed to fade despite the harsh mountain weather. Even the ravens that nested in its eaves appeared larger and more numerous than those found elsewhere, as if the castle itself possessed some dark magnetism that drew the creatures of death to its heights. Emma Brightwater had been among the first to notice something truly wrong. As the daughter of the village baker, she often made deliveries to the castle kitchens, carrying fresh bread and pastries up the winding path that led to the massive iron gates. During these visits, she had caught glimpses of the queen through tall windows, always at dusk when the shadows grew long and the candlelight flickered against the glass. There was something disturbing about these encounters, though Emma couldn't initially place what troubled her so deeply. The realization came to her on a particularly cold autumn evening when she was returning from the castle with her empty baskets. She had paused to rest at the old stone bridge that spanned the rushing stream below Crimsonmere, and as she looked back toward the fortress, she saw Queen Elisara standing at her favorite window in the great hall. The queen's reflection was clearly visible in the glass, illuminated by the warm glow of the fire within. But as Emma watched, she became aware of an impossible detail that made her blood run cold. The reflection showed a woman of perhaps 25 years, radiantly beautiful with unmarked skin and lustrous hair. Yet Emma knew with absolute certainty that Queen Elisara had to be approaching 60 years of age. She had heard the older villagers speak of the queen's marriage to the late King Aldrich 40 years ago, and even then Elisara had not been a child bride. The mathematical impossibility of what she was witnessing sent a chill through Emma's bones that had nothing to do with the mountain air. From that moment forward, Emma began to pay closer attention to the castle and its mysterious mistress. She volunteered for every delivery, every errand that might take her within sight of Crimsonmere's walls. What she discovered during these observations filled her with a growing sense of dread that she dared not share with anyone, for fear of being dismissed as a hysterical girl given to flights of fancy. The Queen's daily routine was unlike anything Emma had ever witnessed. Elisara never appeared during the daylight hours, remaining sequestered within the deepest chambers of the castle until the sun began its descent toward the western peak. Only when dusk painted the sky in shades of blood and shadow would she emerge, always dressed in gowns of midnight black or deep crimson, her pale skin seeming to glow with an inner luminescence that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. But it was the servants who provided the most disturbing clues about their mistress's true nature. The castle staff was composed entirely of young women, none appearing to be older than 25. And they moved about their duties with a strange, mechanical precision that suggested fear rather than loyalty. Their eyes held a haunted quality that Emma recognized from her own nightmares, and they rarely spoke above a whisper when they thought themselves unobserved. Most troubling of all was the rapid turnover among these servants. Emma began keeping a mental catalog of the faces she saw during her visits, and she noticed that girls would disappear with disturbing frequency. When she inquired about a particular maid who had always been kind to her, she was told simply that the girl had gone home to her family or found employment elsewhere. Yet Emma never saw any of these departed servants in the village or the surrounding countryside, and she began to suspect that their fates were far more sinister than anyone dared admit. The castle's architecture itself seemed designed to conceal dark secrets. From her position on the bridge, Emma could see that many of the lower windows had been bricked up, their openings sealed with newer stone that didn't quite match the original construction. The eastern wing of the castle appeared to be unused, its windows dark and lifeless, yet strange sounds sometimes echoed from that direction on still nights. Sounds that might have been wind whistling through empty chambers, or might have been something far more disturbing. The grounds surrounding Crimsonmere told their own story of wrongness. The gardens, once renowned throughout the kingdom for their beauty, had been transformed into something altogether different. Where roses and lilies had once bloomed, now only plants with deep red flowers grew. Varieties that Emma didn't recognize and that seemed to thrive in soil that appeared unusually dark and rich. The fountain in the center of the main courtyard, which had once run with clear mountain water, now flowed with liquid that looked suspiciously dark in the dim light of evening. As autumn deepened into winter, Emma's observations took on an increasingly urgent quality. She had begun to notice a pattern in the disappearances of the castle servants, a rhythm that seemed to correspond with the phases of the moon. During the new moon, when darkness was at its deepest, new girls would arrive at the castle, always young, always beautiful, always bearing the desperate look of those who had no other option. They came from the poorest families in the valley, lured by promises of good wages and comfortable quarters. Yet within a month, sometimes sooner, these same girls would vanish without explanation. The cycle repeated with mechanical precision, as if guided by some ancient and terrible calendar that only Queen Elisara understood. Emma began to suspect that whatever was happening within those sealed chambers was not merely cruel but fundamentally unnatural, a violation of the laws that governed life and death themselves. The breaking point came on the eve of the winter solstice, when Emma encountered one of the castle servants on the village road. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 18, was stumbling through the darkness in a torn and bloodied nightgown, her eyes wide with terror and her body shaking with more than just cold. Emma quickly wrapped her own cloak around the girl and helped her to the warmth of her father's bakery, where she tried to coax information about what had happened at the castle. The servant girl's story, told in broken whispers and interrupted by fits of sobbing, painted a picture of horror that defied belief. She spoke of chambers beneath the castle where screams echoed through the night, of rooms filled with instruments of torture that belonged in the nightmares of the damned. Most disturbing of all, she described midnight rituals in which Queen Elisara would bathe in liquid that steamed and glowed with an unnatural warmth, emerging from these baths with skin that seemed renewed and refreshed. The girl's account might have been dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized mind, but Emma had seen too much to doubt its essential truth. The physical evidence was undeniable. The servant bore marks on her wrists and ankles that spoke of restraints, and there were puncture wounds on her neck and arms that looked as if they had been made by needles or thin blades. Most chilling of all was the girl's insistence that Queen Elisara had looked directly at her during one of these midnight ceremonies and smiled with teeth that seemed too sharp and too white to be entirely human. Before dawn broke over the Drachenwald Valley, the servant girl was dead. Emma found her body in the bakery's storeroom. Her face peaceful despite the violence she had endured. There were no obvious signs of murder, no wounds that would have caused immediate death. Yet Emma was certain that the girl had not died of natural causes. It was as if something vital had been drained from her body, leaving only an empty shell that could no longer sustain life. The girl's death marked the beginning of Emma's true understanding of the evil that dwelt within Crimsonmere Castle. Queen Elisara was not merely cruel or eccentric. She was something fundamentally wrong, a creature that wore the mask of humanity while feeding on the life force of others. The ageless beauty that made her the envy of nobles throughout the realm was not a gift from the gods, but a curse that demanded constant payment in innocent blood. As winter tightened its grip on the valley, Emma began to notice other disturbing changes in the world around Crimsonmere. The animals avoided the area entirely, refusing to graze in fields that had once been their favorite pastures. The stream that flowed down from the castle had developed a reddish tinge that the villagers attributed to iron deposits in the rock. But Emma suspected a more sinister source. Even the weather seemed affected by the Queen's presence, with unnatural fogs that rose from the castle grounds and lingered throughout the day, blocking out the sun and casting the entire valley in perpetual twilight. The true scope of Queen Elisara's crimes was yet to be revealed. But Emma had seen enough to know that the beautiful woman who ruled over them was responsible for horrors that the human mind could barely comprehend. The ageless face that gazed down from the castle windows was not a miracle of nature, but a monument to evil, preserved through acts of such profound wickedness that they had corrupted the very stones of Crimsonmere itself. As the first chapter of this dark tale drew to a close, Emma made a decision that would determine the fate of everyone in the Drachenwald Valley. She would continue her investigations, no matter the personal cost, until she had gathered enough evidence to expose Queen Elisara's crimes to the world. The servant girl's death would not be in vain, and the countless other victims who had disappeared into the castle's depths would finally receive the justice they deserved. The stage was set for a confrontation between innocence and ancient evil, between the natural order of life and death, and the perverted desires of a creature that had transcended human limitations through the most terrible means imaginable. In the depths of Crimsonmere Castle, Queen Elisara continued her unholy rituals, unaware that someone had finally begun to unravel the carefully constructed web of lies and terror that had protected her secret for so many years. The transformation of Elisara von Drachenwald, from a beautiful young queen into the creature that would terrorize the Drachenwald Valley, had not happened overnight. Like all great evils, it had begun with a single moment of weakness, a desperate choice that would echo through the decades and claim hundreds of innocent lives before its terrible conclusion. 43 years earlier, on the night of her 25th birthday, Elisara had stood before the great mirror in her private chambers and wept tears of anguish that would prove to be among the last genuine emotions she would ever experience. The face that stared back at her from the polished silver surface was still beautiful by any reasonable measure, but she could see the first cruel signs of time's passage etched into her features like accusations written in flesh. A fine line had appeared at the corner of her left eye, so subtle that perhaps only she would notice it. Yet to Elisara it might as well have been a death sentence carved into her skin with a blade. Another line threatened to form between her brows, and when she smiled, she could see tiny creases beginning to map themselves around her mouth. Her skin, once as smooth and flawless as fresh cream, had lost some infinitesimal degree of its luminous perfection. The discovery had filled her with a terror so profound that it bordered on madness. Beauty had been Elisara's weapon, her shield, her very identity since childhood. She had used it to escape a life of poverty in a minor noble house, wielding her extraordinary looks like a master swordsman might wield a blade. Her beauty had won her a crown, had made her the most desired woman in 7 kingdoms, had transformed her from a nobody into a legend spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. The thought of losing this power, of watching helplessly as her face crumbled into the ordinary lined visage of any common woman, was more terrifying to her than death itself. She had seen what happened to aging beauties, how quickly they were forgotten, how cruelly they were mocked, how their former admirers turned away with expressions of pity or disgust. The very idea of such a fate made her physically ill. It was in this state of desperate panic that Elisara had first turned to the ancient texts hidden in the deepest vaults beneath Crimsonmere Castle. These books, left behind by previous rulers who had dabbled in the darker arts, contained knowledge that the church had deemed heretical and dangerous. For weeks she pored over their yellowed pages by candlelight, searching for any remedy that might halt or reverse the aging process that threatened to destroy everything she held dear. Most of the rituals described in these volumes were obviously nonsense, the fevered imaginings of madmen and charlatans. But one particular text, bound in leather that felt disturbingly warm to the touch, and written in a script that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light, spoke of methods that resonated with something deep and dark within her soul. The book claimed that youth and beauty could be preserved indefinitely through the regular application of certain essences. The exact nature of these essences was described in terms that were both poetic and horrifying. The author spoke of the crimson river of innocence, of the warm fountain that carries life's sweetest gifts, of rituals that required the willing sacrifice of purity's bloom. To a rational mind, these phrases might have seemed like the meaningless ravings of a diseased imagination, but to Elisara, consumed by her desperate need to preserve her fading beauty, they offered hope wrapped in attractive mystery. The text provided detailed instructions for the preparation and application of these life-giving substances, along with dire warnings about the consequences of failure to maintain the required regimen. According to the ancient author, once the process was begun, it could never be stopped without dire consequences. The practitioner would be bound to continue their rituals or face an aging process so rapid and severe that decades of accumulated time would claim them within a matter of days. For months, Elisara had dismissed these writings as elaborate fantasy, the product of minds unhinged by desperation, similar to her own. But as the signs of aging continued to multiply, another line here, a slight loss of firmness there, her resistance to the book's dark promises began to crumble. When she noticed that her hair had lost some of its lustrous shine, and that her skin no longer glowed with quite the same inner radiance, she made the decision that would damn her soul for eternity. The first victim had been chosen not through careful planning, but through cruel opportunity. Mira Ashbrook was a serving girl of 17, possessed of the kind of natural beauty that needed no adornment to capture attention. She had recently arrived at the castle from a distant village, sent by her impoverished family to work in the queen's household in the hope of earning enough money to support her ailing mother and younger siblings. Mira's beauty was of the pure, untainted variety that the ancient text had specifically mentioned as being most potent for the ritual's purposes. Her skin was flawless, her eyes bright with youth and innocence, her hair the color of spun gold. More importantly, she was friendless and isolated within the castle, having no allies who might ask uncomfortable questions if she were to suddenly disappear. Elisara had begun by befriending the girl, showing her kindnesses that were utterly foreign to her usual treatment of servants. She invited Mira to help with her toilet, claiming that she preferred the gentle touch of someone closer to her own age, rather than the rough ministrations of the older women who usually tended to her needs. During these intimate sessions, she studied the girl's perfect complexion with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript, memorizing every detail of the youth and vitality that she herself was losing. The preparations for the ritual had taken weeks to complete. Following the instructions in the ancient text, Elisara had prepared a special chamber in the deepest part of the castle, a room that had once been used for storing wine, but now served a far more sinister purpose. She lined the walls with black cloth and installed braziers that filled the space with the acrid smoke of herbs that were said to attract dark spiritual forces. At the center of the room, she placed a basin carved from a single piece of obsidian, its interior polished to a mirror-like finish. The most challenging aspect of the preparation had been obtaining the specialized implements described in the text. These were not mere knives or swords, but delicate instruments designed to extract life essence with minimal damage to the physical vessel. Through careful inquiries made to traders who dealt in exotic goods, Elisara had managed to acquire a collection of needle-sharp blades made from meteoric iron, their edges honed to a degree of sharpness that could part flesh like silk. On the night chosen for the ritual, the new moon of the autumn equinox, when the boundary between life and death was said to be at its thinnest, Elisara had lured Mira to the prepared chamber under the pretense of showing her a special treasure. The girl had followed trustingly, her eyes wide with curiosity and excitement at being included in what she believed was a mark of special favor from her mysterious and beautiful mistress. The transformation from trusted confidant to predator had happened in an instant. One moment, Elisara was smiling warmly at the unsuspecting girl. The next, she had struck with the speed and precision of a serpent. The blow to Mira's head had been calculated to render her unconscious without causing permanent damage. After all, the ritual required that the subject be alive during the extraction process. When Mira awoke, she found herself secured to a stone table in the center of the ritual chamber, her wrists and ankles bound with silk cords that were gentle enough not to bruise her skin but strong enough to prevent any hope of escape. The terror in her eyes when she realized her situation had been almost beautiful in its purity, and Elisara had paused for a moment to appreciate the exquisite sight of innocence confronted with its inevitable destruction. The girl's pleas for mercy had fallen on ears that were no longer capable of hearing such appeals. Elisara had moved about the chamber with mechanical precision, lighting candles, arranging her implements, preparing the obsidian basin that would soon contain the precious essence she needed to preserve her fading beauty. The ancient text had been specific about the importance of maintaining proper ritual protocols. Any deviation from the prescribed procedures could result in the essence losing its potency or, worse, becoming contaminated with spiritual impurities that would corrupt the final product. The extraction process itself had been surprisingly simple, requiring more patience than skill. Using the meteoric iron blades, Elisara had made precise incisions at specific points on Mira's body, following diagrams in the ancient text that mapped the optimal locations for accessing the life force. The girl's blood had flowed warm and red into the obsidian basin, carrying with it something intangible but precious. The very essence of youth and vitality that Elisara coveted above all else. What had surprised Elisara was how natural the process had felt, how right it had seemed to take what she needed from someone who had so much to spare. Mira's youth was wasted on a mere serving girl who would have lived an obscure life of drudgery and hardship. In Elisara's hands, that same youth would be transformed into something magnificent, preserved in service to beauty and power, that deserved to endure through the ages. The girl's death had come gradually, her life essence ebbing away drop by precious drop as Elisara carefully collected every portion of the vital fluid. By the time the process was complete, Mira's body had taken on the pale, waxen appearance of a discarded doll, her once bright eyes now staring sightlessly at the chamber's vaulted ceiling. Yet there had been something almost peaceful about her final expression, as if in her last moments, she had understood the honor of contributing to something greater than her own insignificant existence. The application of the life essence had been the most extraordinary experience of Elisara's life. Following the ritual instructions, she had heated the collected fluid over a flame fed by rare woods and exotic spices, until it reached the perfect temperature, warm enough to penetrate the skin, but not so hot as to damage the delicate properties that made it effective. Then, in a bath that had been prepared according to ancient specifications, she had immersed herself in the crimson liquid and felt its power flow into every pore of her body. The transformation had been immediate and miraculous. The fine lines around her eyes had smoothed away as if they had never existed. The subtle sagging of her skin had reversed itself, restoring the perfect tautness of youth. Even her hair had regained its lustrous shine, and her eyes had brightened with renewed vitality. Looking at herself in the mirror afterward, Elisara had seen not just the restoration of her former beauty, but an enhancement that made her more radiant than she had ever been before. The disposal of Mira's remains had been handled with the same meticulous care that had characterized every other aspect of the ritual. The ancient text had provided specific instructions for this phase as well, explaining that the physical vessel, once emptied of its vital essence, must be treated with certain chemicals to prevent spiritual contamination of the ritual site. Elisara had dissolved the body in acids obtained through her network of discreet suppliers, leaving no trace that the girl had ever existed beyond the official records that showed her departure from the castle to visit family in distant lands. In the days that followed her first ritual, Elisara had experienced a euphoria unlike anything she had ever known. The servants and courtiers who saw her remarked on her renewed radiance, attributing it to some new cosmetic preparation or perhaps to the glow of happiness from recent good news. None suspected that her transformation had been purchased with an innocent girl's life, or that the warm contentment in her smile came from the knowledge that she had discovered the secret to eternal beauty. Yet, even as she basked in the success of her dark experiment, Elisara could feel the first stirrings of an addiction that would come to dominate every aspect of her existence. The power she had gained from Mira's sacrifice was intoxicating, but she could sense that it was not permanent. Like a drug that demanded ever-increasing doses to maintain its effects, the life essence she had absorbed would eventually fade, requiring replenishment through additional rituals. The ancient text had warned of this dependency, describing it as both a blessing and a curse. The blessing lay in the unlimited potential for renewal, the promise that beauty and youth could be maintained indefinitely for those brave enough to seize what they needed. The curse was in the binding nature of the process. Once begun, it could never be abandoned without facing consequences too terrible to contemplate. As she stood before her mirror on that first night after the ritual, admiring the flawless reflection that gazed back at her with eyes that now held depths of darkness that had not been there before, Elisara made a conscious choice to embrace her new nature fully. She would not be bound by the weak moral constraints that limited ordinary people. She would take what she needed to preserve her beauty, and she would do whatever was necessary to maintain the power that youth and perfection had given her. The transformation was complete. The frightened young woman who had wept over the first signs of aging was gone forever, replaced by something that wore her face but possessed a soul as cold and hard as the obsidian basin that had held her first victim's life essence. Queen Elisara von Drachenwald had taken her first step down a path that would lead to centuries of horror, and she had done so with eyes wide open and a heart filled with dark satisfaction. The months following Mira's death had revealed to Elisara the true scope of the commitment she had made to preserve her unnatural beauty. What had begun as a desperate act born of vanity had evolved into something far more systematic and horrifying, a carefully orchestrated program of murder that would transform Crimsonmere Castle into a charnel house disguised as a royal residence. The effects of her first blood ritual had lasted precisely 3 months and 17 days. Elisara had counted each day with growing anxiety as she watched for the first signs that the stolen essence was beginning to fade. The return of aging had been subtle at first, a barely perceptible dulling of her skin's luminescence, a slight decrease in the elasticity of her flesh around her eyes. But these minor changes had sent her into a panic that bordered on madness, driving her to prepare for her second ritual with an efficiency that would have impressed the most dedicated military strategist. The ancient text had been explicit about the increasing demands of the process. Each subsequent ritual would provide benefits of shorter duration, requiring more frequent applications of life essence to maintain the desired effects. Furthermore, the quality of the source material would become increasingly important as her body developed a tolerance to the weaker emanations of ordinary victims. She would need to be more selective, more discriminating in her choice of subjects, seeking out those whose youth and vitality burned brightest. It was this realization that had prompted Elisara to begin the construction of what would become known to her handful of trusted confederates as the preservation chambers, a series of rooms carved deep into the bedrock beneath Crimsonmere Castle, accessible only through a hidden entrance behind the wine cellars. The project had taken nearly 6 months to complete, requiring the services of stonemasons, metalworkers, and other craftsmen who were paid generously for their work and their silence. The men who had built these chambers had believed they were constructing elaborate storage rooms for the Queen's most valuable possessions. They had no way of knowing that the drainage systems they installed would be used to channel away the blood of torture victims, or that the iron fixtures they mounted to the walls would serve to restrain struggling captives. By the time the construction was complete, most of these workers had suffered convenient accidents or had simply disappeared during their journey home, taking their knowledge of the chamber's true purpose with them to unmarked graves. The main ritual chamber had been designed according to specifications found in the most detailed sections of the ancient text. The room was circular, its walls carved from living rock and lined with symbols that predated Christianity by centuries. At the center stood a raised platform of black marble, its surface carved with channels that would direct the flow of vital fluids toward collection points around its perimeter. Suspended above this altar was an array of iron restraints that could be adjusted to accommodate victims of various sizes, ensuring that they remained perfectly positioned throughout the extraction process. Surrounding the main chamber were smaller rooms that served various functions in Elisara's expanding operation. One contained the specialized tools that she had commissioned from master craftsmen in distant cities, implements of such precise cruelty that their makers had required detailed drawings to understand their intended purpose. Another room housed the collection of rare chemicals and preservatives needed to maintain the potency of extracted life essence, allowing her to store quantities for future use when fresh sources might not be readily available. Perhaps the most sinister of these auxiliary chambers was what Elisara privately called her selection room, a space designed to hold multiple victims while she decided which would provide the highest quality essence for her rituals. The room was fitted with individual cells barely large enough for a person to lie down, each equipped with viewing slots that allowed her to observe her captives without being seen. Here she could study her victims for days or weeks, monitoring their health, their fear levels, and the subtle emanations of life force that would help her determine the optimal timing for their use. The process of acquiring suitable victims had evolved from the opportunistic approach she had used with Mira into something far more sophisticated and methodical. Elisara had established a network of agents throughout the kingdom, men and women of flexible morals who were tasked with identifying and acquiring young people who met her increasingly specific requirements. These procurers operated under the guise of talent scouts for various legitimate enterprises, theatrical troupes, noble households, religious institutions that provided convenient cover for their true activities. The ideal victim profile had become refined through bitter experience and careful study of the ancient texts. Girls between the ages of 16 and 20 proved to provide the most potent essence, particularly those who had lived relatively sheltered lives and retained what the text described as spiritual purity. Physical beauty was important, but not essential. What mattered more was the strength of the life force, which could be detected by those trained to recognize its subtle signs. Elisara had learned to identify these signs with the expertise of a master vintner. Evaluating rare wines, she could detect the brightness of spirit in a girl's eyes, the vitality that made her skin glow with inner health, the almost imperceptible aura of life energy that surrounded those whose essence burned most intensely. These were the ones she valued most highly, the premium sources whose sacrifice would provide the greatest benefit to her preservation efforts. The selection process had become ritualized in its own right, following patterns that satisfied both practical necessities and Elisara's growing need for psychological dominance over her victims. New arrivals at the castle were housed in comfortable quarters and treated with apparent kindness while she evaluated their potential. They were given fine food, beautiful clothes, and the illusion that they had found positions of privilege within the royal household. During this evaluation period, which typically lasted between 2 weeks and a month, Elisara would conduct daily interviews with each potential victim. These sessions were ostensibly designed to assess their skills and determine their fitness for various positions within the castle. But their true purpose was to allow her to study the girls' spiritual emanations and psychological profiles. She needed to understand not just the quantity of life force they possessed, but the quality of their fear, their capacity for despair, and their likely responses to the horrors that awaited them. The ancient text had been specific about the importance of emotional state during the extraction process. Victims who died in a state of pure terror produced essence that was tainted with psychic impurities, resulting in preservation effects that were shorter-lived and less complete. The optimal emotional state was a combination of confusion, betrayal, and resignation, feelings that produced life essence of exceptional purity and potency. To achieve this ideal psychological condition, Elisara had developed techniques that were as much art as science. She would gradually erode her victim's sense of security through subtle manipulations, introducing small inconsistencies and irregularities into their daily routines that would create underlying anxiety without triggering panic. She would share carefully crafted confidences that made the girls feel specially chosen, while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt about their ultimate fate. The culmination of this psychological conditioning came during what Elisara called the revelation phase, the moment when her victims first understood the true nature of their situation. This was typically staged in the selection room, where the girls would be brought under some pretext and then shown the other captives who awaited their fate. The shock of this discovery, combined with the realization that their trusted benefactor was in fact their executioner, produced an emotional state that was ideal for the upcoming ritual. Elisara had perfected the timing of this revelation to maximize its psychological impact. The girls were usually brought to the selection room at dusk, when the shadows cast by the torchlight created an atmosphere of primal dread. She would appear dressed in her ritual robes, garments of deep crimson silk embroidered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and speak to them in a voice that had been trained to convey both authority and inevitability. The speech she gave to each group of victims had evolved over time into a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. She would begin by thanking them for their service to the crown, explaining that they had been chosen for a great honor that would allow them to contribute to something far more important than their individual lives. She would describe the preservation of beauty as a sacred duty, painting herself as a guardian of perfection in a world that sought to destroy all that was lovely and pure. As the girl's initial confusion gave way to understanding and then to terror, Elisara would continue her monologue, explaining the practical aspects of what would happen to them with the clinical detachment of a physician describing a medical procedure. She would assure them that their deaths would have meaning, that their sacrifice would preserve something precious and eternal. Most importantly, she would make it clear that resistance was not only futile, but would result in unnecessary suffering for both themselves and their families. The first group of victims selected through this systematic approach had consisted of 5 girls, each chosen for specific qualities that would contribute to what Elisara envisioned as her first truly scientific preservation ritual. There was Clara, a miller's daughter whose robust health and country upbringing had given her a particularly strong life vice. Beside her cowered Beatrice, a merchant's daughter whose refined beauty and sheltered existence had preserved the spiritual purity that Elisara prized so highly. The other 3 girls represented different aspects of the ideal victim profile that Elisara was still refining through experimentation. Agnes was notable for her extreme youth, barely 16 and possessed of the intense vitality that came with the first flowering of womanhood. Cordelia brought artistic sensitivity to the group, her poet's soul supposedly carrying types of spiritual essence that the ancient texts claimed were especially valuable. Finally, there was Rose, a farm girl whose combination of physical strength and emotional innocence promised to provide essence of exceptional stability and longevity. The ritual that claimed these 5 lives had been conducted over the course of 3 nights, with Elisara carefully spacing the extractions to allow for proper preparation and storage of each victim's essence. She had begun with Agnes, whose youth made her essence the most volatile and therefore required immediate use. The girl's death had been surprisingly peaceful, her terror giving way to a strange calm as her life force was slowly drawn from her body through the network of carefully placed incisions. Each subsequent victim had provided slightly different qualities of essence, confirming Elisara's theories about the relationship between personality, circumstance, and spiritual energy. Clara's robust country health had yielded essence of exceptional quantity, while Beatrice's refined nature had produced fluid of remarkable purity. The poet Cordelia had indeed provided essence with unique properties, a subtle luminescence that seemed to enhance not just physical beauty but mental acuity as well. The final victim, Rose, had presented unexpected complications that would influence all of Elisara's future rituals. The girl's combination of physical strength and strong will had made her more resistant to the extraction process than anticipated. Her struggles had disrupted the careful positioning required for optimal essence collection, and her angry defiance had tainted the final product with psychic impurities that reduced its effectiveness. This experience had taught Elisara the importance of proper sedation and restraint systems, leading to refinements in her chamber design and the development of herbal preparations that would keep victims conscious but compliant during the extraction process. She had also learned to screen more carefully for psychological traits that might interfere with the ritual requirements, eliminating candidates whose strong wills or rebellious natures made them unsuitable for her purposes. The combined essence from these 5 victims had provided Elisara with preservation effects that lasted nearly 8 months, a significant improvement over her initial experiment with Mira. More importantly, the quality of preservation had been enhanced as well. Not only had her existing beauty been maintained, but she had noticed improvements in aspects of her appearance that had been less than perfect before beginning her dark experiments. The success of this first systematic ritual had convinced Elisara that she was on the correct path toward achieving true immortality through the careful application of scientific principles to ancient knowledge. She began keeping detailed records of each ritual, noting the characteristics of her victims, the specific procedures used, and the duration and quality of the resulting preservation effects. These records, written in a cipher of her own devising, would eventually fill dozens of leather-bound volumes hidden in the deepest recesses of her private study. As word spread through her network of procurers about the Queen's satisfaction with their recent acquisitions, the flow of potential victims to Crimsonmere began to increase dramatically. Young women arrived at the castle with increasing frequency, each believing that she had been chosen for some position of honor or opportunity. In reality, they were merely raw materials for Elisara's growing operation, their value measured not in terms of their humanity but in the quality and quantity of life essence they could provide. The transformation of Crimsonmere from a royal residence into a factory of death had been completed with remarkable efficiency. What had begun as a single desperate act to preserve fading beauty had evolved into an industrial process for harvesting life itself. And at the center of it all stood Queen Elisara, no longer recognizable as the frightened young woman who had once wept over the first signs of aging, now transformed into something that existed solely to consume the youth and vitality of others. The blood rituals had become the organizing principle of her existence, the sacred ceremonies around which all other activities revolved. She was no longer a queen who happened to practice dark magic. She had become a creature of pure appetite, a predator whose every thought and action was directed toward the acquisition and consumption of the life force that sustained her unnatural beauty. As Elisara's appetite for life essence grew, ever more insatiable, the systematic acquisition of victims evolved from a network of opportunistic recruiters into something resembling a well-organized criminal enterprise that stretched across multiple kingdoms. What had once been random selections of vulnerable young women had transformed into a carefully orchestrated harvesting operation that targeted specific communities and employed increasingly sophisticated methods of deception and coercion. The Queen's primary agent in these expanded operations was a man known only as Corvus, a former priest who had been defrocked for practices that the Church deemed unspeakably heretical. His background in religious ministry had provided him with intimate knowledge of rural communities and their customs, making him invaluable in identifying targets and crafting the elaborate deceptions necessary to lure them to Crimsonmere Castle. His fallen status had left him with nothing to lose and everything to gain from serving a mistress who rewarded loyalty with gold and punished failure with death. Corvus had developed what he called the marriage market system, a network of false identities and fabricated opportunities that allowed him to approach families in distant villages with offers that seemed too good to refuse. He would arrive in each settlement dressed as a well-to-do merchant or minor noble's representative, carrying official-looking documents and speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to making important decisions. His target audience consisted of families whose poverty made them desperate enough to consider unusual arrangements for their daughters' futures. The deception typically began with carefully planted rumors about wealthy lords seeking wives from virtuous rural families, men who preferred the honest simplicity of country girls to the corrupted sophistication of court ladies. These rumors would circulate through taverns and market squares for weeks before Corvus made his appearance, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and hope that made his eventual proposals seem like answered prayers rather than elaborate traps. When Corvus finally revealed himself to selected families, he came bearing gifts that demonstrated both generosity and serious intent. Fine cloth for the mother, quality tools for the father, small toys or sweets for younger children, tokens that suggested the wealth and benevolence of his supposed employer. He would spend days in each village, attending church services and participating in community activities, establishing himself as a respectable figure worthy of trust. The actual recruitment pitch was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that played upon every parent's desire to see their daughter elevated above the circumstances of her birth. Corvus would describe fictional lords who had been widowed young and sought new wives from families of proven virtue and moral strength. These imaginary suitors were always portrayed as kind, handsome, and desperately lonely, romantic figures who would treat their new brides with the devotion and respect that every father hoped his daughter would receive. The financial arrangements he proposed were designed to overcome any hesitation the families might feel about parting with their daughters. He would offer substantial bride prices, sums of money that represented more wealth than most peasant families would see in a lifetime. Additionally, he promised ongoing support for the families left behind, describing how the grateful new husbands would ensure that their in-laws never wanted for anything again. To make these offers even more appealing, Corvus had developed a collection of forged letters supposedly written by girls who had previously made such matches. These documents, written in carefully practiced feminine handwriting, described lives of luxury and happiness in great houses throughout the realm. They spoke of kind husbands, beautiful gowns, and comfortable chambers, painting pictures of fairy tale existences that made the harsh realities of rural poverty seem even more unbearable by comparison. The selection criteria that Corvus used when evaluating potential victims had been refined through extensive consultation with Elisara and careful study of her ritual requirements. Physical beauty was important, but not in the conventional sense that most people understood it. What mattered was not classical perfection of features, but rather the subtle radiance that indicated strong life force, a quality that was often more pronounced in girls who had led active, healthy outdoor lives than in those who had been pampered and protected. Age was perhaps the most critical factor, with the optimal range being between 16 and 19 years. Younger girls often lacked the fully developed life essence that Elisara required, while those over 20 typically showed the first signs of the spiritual dulling that came with exposure to the world's harsh realities. The ideal victims were those who stood at the perfect moment of transition between childhood innocence and adult experience, their life force burning at its brightest before the inevitable processes of aging and disillusionment began to dim its intensity. Personality traits were equally important, though more difficult to assess during the brief evaluation periods that Corvus's deceptions allowed. The ancient texts had been specific about the types of psychological profiles that produced the highest quality essence, favoring girls who combined innocence with underlying strength of character. Those who were too timid often produced essence tainted with fear, while those who were too worldly lacked the spiritual purity that Elisara prized above all other qualities. Religious devotion was another factor that Corvus learned to evaluate, as deeply pious girls often possessed types of spiritual energy that enhanced the preservation effects of their essence. However, this had to be balanced against practical considerations, as the most devout candidates were also the most likely to resist the psychological conditioning that preceded their eventual sacrifice. The ideal victims were those whose faith was strong enough to purify their essence, but not so fanatical as to make them difficult to manage during the preparation phase. The logistics of transporting victims from their home villages to Crimsonmere Castle had evolved into an elaborate system that involved multiple stages of deception and misdirection. Corvus would arrange for the selected girls to meet their supposed future husbands at various intermediate locations, explaining that the lords in question were traveling on business and preferred to conduct their courtships away from the distractions of their own territories. These intermediate stops served multiple purposes in Elisara's operation. They provided opportunities to assess the victims more thoroughly and make final decisions about their suitability for ritual use. They also allowed for the psychological conditioning that was so crucial to producing high-quality essence, as the girls could be gradually isolated from their support networks and made increasingly dependent on their captors' goodwill. The actual journey to Crimsonmere was typically disguised as a wedding procession, with the victims dressed in fine gowns and traveling in comfortable carriages that suggested the wealth and status of their supposed new families. They were accompanied by female attendants, women who were actually experienced members of Elisara's staff but who presented themselves as ladies-in-waiting sent by the bride's new household to assist with her preparation and transition. These attendants played crucial roles in the final phase of the deception, gradually revealing selected aspects of the truth, while maintaining the overall fiction that the girls were destined for lives of privilege and happiness. They would speak of the mysterious nature of their employers, describing them as reclusive but generous, eccentric but fundamentally kind. This preparation helped to reduce the shock that the victims would experience when they finally encountered the reality of their situation. The arrival at Crimsonmere Castle was choreographed to reinforce the illusion of legitimacy while beginning the process of psychological isolation that would continue until the moment of each victim's death. The girls were housed in comfortable chambers that had been specially prepared to suggest luxury while actually serving as gilded prisons. The windows were too small and too high to allow escape. The doors were fitted with locks that could only be operated from the outside, and the walls were thick enough to muffle any sounds that might disturb other residents of the castle. During their initial weeks at Crimsonmere, the new arrivals were treated with apparent kindness and respect. They were provided with beautiful clothing, excellent food, and entertainment designed to keep them content and unsuspecting. Elisara herself would often visit them during this period, presenting herself as a kindly older woman who took personal interest in ensuring their comfort and happiness while they awaited their wedding ceremony. These visits served the dual purpose of maintaining the deception while allowing Elisara to conduct her detailed assessments of each victim's spiritual qualities. She had developed techniques for measuring life force that involved subtle physical contact. A hand placed gently on a shoulder, fingers brushed across a wrist while adjusting a bracelet. Embraces that appeared maternal but actually allowed her to sense the intensity and purity of each girl's essence. The revelation of their true fate was timed to coincide with the optimal moment for essence extraction, typically after the victims had been at the castle long enough to lose hope of immediate rescue, but not so long that despair had begun to corrupt the purity of their life force. This delicate timing required careful monitoring of each girl's psychological state, watching for the subtle signs that indicated when fear and confusion had achieved the perfect balance that would produce the highest quality essence. One of the most successful harvests during this period had involved a group of 7 sisters from a remote mountain village, all of whom had been acquired through an elaborate deception involving a fictional nobleman who claimed to be seeking multiple wives to repopulate his war-devastated lands. The sisters, ranging in age from 16 to 22, had represented a unique opportunity to study how family relationships and shared experiences affected the quality of life essence. The eldest sister, Helena, had possessed the strong, stable essence that came from accepting responsibility for others at a young age. Her life force had been colored by the sacrifices she had made for her siblings, giving it a quality that Elisara found particularly useful for rituals intended to enhance mental clarity and emotional stability. The youngest, Isabel, had radiated the pure, untainted vitality of someone who had been protected and cherished throughout her short life, her essence carrying the concentrated power of innocence preserved against all odds. The middle sisters had each contributed their own unique qualities to what became known as Elisara's family ritual, a complex ceremony that involved extracting and combining essences from all 7 victims over the course of a single night. The resulting preservation effects had been extraordinary, lasting for nearly 2 years and providing enhancements to Elisara's beauty that surpassed anything she had previously achieved. The success of the family ritual had convinced Elisara that there were still aspects of the ancient knowledge that she had not fully explored, possibilities for enhancement and refinement that could extend the periods between rituals and increase the magnitude of their effects. She began to seek out increasingly rare and specialized victims, targeting girls with specific bloodlines, unusual spiritual gifts, or unique life experiences that might contribute previously unknown qualities to her preservation efforts. This pursuit of perfection in her victims had led to increasingly bold operations that pushed the boundaries of what even her extensive network could accomplish safely. Corvus had begun targeting daughters of minor nobility, girls whose disappearances would attract more attention, but whose refined breeding and protected upbringings promised to yield essence of unprecedented purity and potency. The risks involved in these expanded operations were considerable, but Elisara's hunger for more powerful sources of life essence had grown beyond the point where such concerns could deter her. She had tasted the ultimate power that came from consuming the concentrated vitality of others, and no amount of caution or common sense could prevent her from seeking ever greater heights of stolen beauty and artificial youth. The machinery of death that she had constructed around herself continued to grow and evolve, driven by an appetite that could never be satisfied, and fed by an endless supply of victims whose only crime was possessing the youth and innocence that she coveted above all else. The harvest of innocence had become the organizing principle of her existence, and she would continue to reap this terrible crop until someone found the courage and means to stop her. As the fourth chapter of her reign of terror drew to a close, Elisara stood at the pinnacle of her power, commanding resources and wielding influence that made her virtually untouchable. Yet the very success of her operations was beginning to attract the kind of attention that would eventually lead to her downfall, as the systematic disappearance of young women across multiple kingdoms began to form a pattern that even the most incompetent investigators could not ignore indefinitely. By the time Elisara entered the 20th year of her unholy preservation rituals, she had transcended the boundaries of mere human evil and become something altogether more monstrous. A creature whose appetite for innocent blood had grown so insatiable that even the elaborate harvesting operation she had constructed could barely satisfy her needs. What had once been monthly rituals had evolved into weekly ceremonies, and even these were supplemented by daily applications of stored essence that kept her supernatural beauty burning at its brightest intensity. The castle itself had been transformed to accommodate this escalation in her activities. Entire wings had been converted into processing facilities, where captured victims could be prepared, evaluated, and stored until their appointed times of sacrifice. The original ritual chamber had been expanded into a complex of interconnected spaces, each designed for specific aspects of the extraction and preservation process. The engineering required for these modifications had been accomplished through the forced labor of prisoners and the coerced assistance of craftsmen whose families were held as guarantees of their silence and cooperation. The most dramatic change in Elisara's routine was the introduction of what she privately called her daily enhancement baths. Rituals that involved immersing herself in warm blood drawn from living victims who were kept alive specifically for this purpose. These unfortunate souls were housed in specialized chambers where they could be accessed quickly whenever Elisara felt her appearance beginning to show even the slightest signs of deterioration. The process had been refined to allow for the extraction of small quantities of blood without immediately killing the source, extending the useful life of each victim over periods of weeks or months. The selection of these permanent donors required even more precise evaluation than the victims chosen for full ritual sacrifice. They needed to possess not only the spiritual qualities that produced high-grade essence, but also the physical resilience necessary to survive repeated blood extractions. Elisara had discovered through experimentation that certain bloodlines seemed to possess natural resistance to the weakening effects of regular drainage, allowing her to maintain a stable supply of victims who could serve her needs over extended periods. Among her most prized permanent donors was a girl named Serafina, the daughter of a renowned healer, whose bloodline was rumored to carry traces of ancient magic. Serafina's essence possessed qualities that seemed to enhance not only Elisara's physical beauty, but also her mental acuity and spiritual vitality. The girl had been kept alive for over 2 years, carefully maintained in a state of semi-consciousness that prevented her from fully comprehending her situation while preserving the purity of her life force. The daily routine that had evolved around these enhancement baths was elaborate and ritualistic, following patterns that satisfied both practical requirements and Elisara's growing psychological need for ceremony and control. Each morning, she would descend to the preparation chambers where her selected donors awaited, their bodies carefully maintained by a staff of attendants, who had been trained to extract blood with minimal trauma to the source. The bath itself was conducted in a specially constructed pool lined with materials that had been blessed according to the instructions found in the most ancient texts. The blood was warmed to precise temperatures and mixed with rare oils and essences that enhanced its preservative properties. Elisara would immerse herself in this crimson pool while chanting incantations in languages that predated recorded history, feeling the stolen vitality flow into every pore of her body and renew the supernatural perfection that had become her trademark. The effects of these daily treatments were remarkable, even by the standards of what she had previously achieved. Her beauty had transcended normal human limitations, taking on an otherworldly quality that was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling to those who encountered her. Her skin glowed with an inner radiance that seemed to generate its own light. Her eyes held depths that suggested knowledge of secrets too terrible for mortal minds to comprehend. And her very presence emanated an aura of power that made even the bravest men tremble in her sight. Yet this escalation in her activities had begun to create problems that even Elisara's considerable resources and influence could not entirely suppress. The sheer volume of victims required to maintain her enhanced regimen meant that her procurement network had to operate on a scale that was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. Villages throughout the region were reporting unprecedented numbers of missing young women, and the pattern of disappearances was becoming too obvious to ignore. More troubling still was the effect that her intensified rituals were having on the castle staff who were required to assist with her activities. The original servants who had helped with her early experiments had been gradually replaced as they succumbed to madness, despair, or simply the physical strain of participating in such sustained horror. The current staff consisted largely of individuals who had been coerced into service through threats to their families or who had been so thoroughly broken by their experiences that they no longer possessed the capacity for independent thought. Among these broken souls, however, a small group of women had begun to develop a different kind of relationship with their situation. Led by a former nun named Sister Agatha, who had been forced into service after her convent was destroyed in a fire that claimed her fellow sisters, these women had found ways to maintain their sanity and sense of purpose by secretly working to document Elisara's crimes and preserve evidence that might eventually be used against her. Sister Agatha had been uniquely suited for this role, due to her literacy and her intimate knowledge of religious texts that provided context for understanding the true nature of Elisara's practices. She recognized the rituals being performed as corrupted versions of ancient rites that had been condemned by the church centuries earlier, and she understood that what she was witnessing represented not merely criminal behavior but genuine spiritual evil that posed a threat to the natural order itself. The evidence that Sister Agatha and her companions had been secretly gathering was hidden in locations throughout the castle that Elisara rarely visited. They had documented the names and origins of hundreds of victims, recorded details of the ritual procedures, and even managed to copy portions of the ancient texts that formed the basis of Elisara's knowledge. Most importantly, they had begun to map the full extent of the procurement network and identify the key individuals whose cooperation made the entire operation possible. This intelligence gathering had been accomplished at enormous personal risk, as discovery would have meant not just death, but the kind of prolonged torture that Elisara reserved for those who betrayed her trust. The women involved had developed elaborate systems of coded communication and dead drops that allowed them to share information without arousing suspicion. They had also begun to establish contact with allies outside the castle, using their knowledge of the supply routes to send messages to religious authorities and government officials who might have the power to intervene. The psychological toll of maintaining this resistance, while continuing to participate in daily atrocities, had been devastating for all involved. Sister Agatha herself had begun to show signs of the spiritual corruption that seemed to affect everyone who spent extended periods in close proximity to Elisara's rituals. Her hair had turned completely white despite her relatively young age. Her hands shook constantly from nervous tension, and she had developed a persistent cough that she attributed to breathing air that had been poisoned by the constant presence of death and suffering. Yet despite these personal costs, The resistance group had managed to accomplish something that would prove crucial to Elisara's eventual downfall. They had identified patterns in her behavior and dependencies in her operation that could potentially be exploited by those with the knowledge and resources to take action. They had also begun to understand the true nature of the ancient texts that guided her rituals, discovering references to countering spells and protective measures that might offer some defense against her supernatural powers. The most significant development in their covert activities had been the establishment of communication with Emma Brightwater, the baker's daughter whose early observations had first revealed the true nature of life at Crimsonmere Castle. Through a network of contacts that included sympathetic merchants and traveling priests, they had managed to convey detailed information about Elisara's activities to the outside world, providing the evidence that would eventually prompt official investigation into the castle's affairs. Meanwhile, Elisara herself remained largely oblivious to these developments. Consumed as she was by her escalating rituals and the increasingly complex requirements of maintaining her supernatural beauty, her paranoia had grown along with her power, leading her to trust no one completely and to view every interaction through the lens of potential threat or opportunity. Yet this very paranoia had created blind spots that the resistance was able to exploit, as her focus on external threats prevented her from recognizing the danger posed by those who served her daily. The peak of her power had also brought with it a growing sense of invulnerability that would prove to be her greatest weakness. After 2 decades of successful operations, she had begun to believe that she was truly beyond the reach of any earthly authority. This confidence had led her to take increasingly bold risks, expanding her activities in ways that left her more exposed to detection and retaliation. One particularly dangerous development was her decision to begin targeting victims from noble families. Girls whose disappearances would attract attention from powerful individuals with the resources to conduct thorough investigations. The essence produced by these high-born victims was indeed superior to that obtained from peasant girls, but the political risks involved in their acquisition far outweighed the benefits. Yet Elisara's hunger for ever more potent sources of life force had overcome her customary caution, leading her to approve operations that wise counsel would have rejected. The consequences of these decisions were already beginning to manifest in ways that should have served as warnings to someone less consumed by her own appetites. Several noble families had begun their own investigations into their daughters' disappearances, employing private agents and offering substantial rewards for information. Some of these inquiries had begun to converge on Crimsonmere Castle, creating a web of suspicion that was slowly tightening around Elisara's operation. At the same time, the sheer scale of her activities had begun to strain the resources and infrastructure that supported them. The cost of maintaining her procurement network, the logistical challenges of processing so many victims, and the security requirements for concealing such extensive operations had grown beyond what even her considerable wealth could easily support. The financial pressures were forcing her to cut corners and take shortcuts that introduced additional vulnerabilities into an operation that had previously been characterized by meticulous planning and execution. Perhaps most ominously, the spiritual corruption that surrounded her rituals had begun to manifest in ways that extended beyond the immediate vicinity of the castle. The land itself seemed to be responding to the sustained presence of such concentrated evil, with crops failing in nearby fields, livestock sickening without apparent cause, and wildlife fleeing the region as if driven by some instinctive recognition of danger. These environmental changes had not gone unnoticed by the surrounding population, who had begun to speak in whispers of curses and supernatural influences. While most remained too fearful of Elisara's power to voice their suspicions openly, the growing sense of unease was creating an atmosphere in which more direct challenges to her authority might eventually find support and encouragement. As the 5th phase of Elisara's reign of terror reached its climax, all the elements necessary for her eventual downfall were falling into place. The resistance network within the castle continued to gather evidence and establish outside contacts. The noble families whose daughters had been taken were conducting increasingly sophisticated investigations, And the very success of her operations was creating vulnerabilities that her enemies would soon learn to exploit. Yet for now, in these final moments of her unchallenged power, Elisara continued her daily bloodbaths in blissful ignorance of the forces gathering against her. She had achieved a level of supernatural beauty and vitality that exceeded even her most ambitious dreams, commanding resources and wielding influence that made her seem untouchable. The Blood Countess stood at the absolute peak of her terrible power, unaware that she had already taken the first steps down the path that would lead to her ultimate destruction. The beginning of Elisara's downfall could be traced to a single moment of carelessness that shattered 2 decades of carefully maintained secrecy. On a fog-shrouded night in late autumn, as the castle slept under the weight of its accumulated sins, a young woman named Sarah Blackthorne managed to accomplish what hundreds before her had died attempting. She escaped from the depths of Crimsonmere Castle and lived to tell the world what horrors lay hidden beneath its ancient stones. Sarah had been among a group of 12 girls, acquired through one of Corvus's most elaborate deceptions, a scheme that had targeted the daughters of wealthy merchants in the coastal city of Golden Harbor. The girls had been lured to the castle with promises of positions as ladies-in-waiting to a fictional duchess, their families paying substantial fees for what they believed was an opportunity to elevate their daughter's social status. Instead, they had found themselves prisoners in Elisara's carefully orchestrated nightmare, awaiting their turns to feed the queen's insatiable hunger for innocent blood. What made Sarah different from the countless victims who had preceded her was not just her determination to escape, but her unique background that had prepared her for survival in ways that neither Elisara nor her agents had anticipated. The daughter of a former soldier turned merchant, Sarah had been taught skills that were unusual for a young woman of her station: basic knowledge of locks and security measures, techniques for moving silently through buildings, and most importantly, the mental discipline needed to function effectively under extreme stress. Her opportunity for escape had come during the chaos that followed a failed ritual involving one of her fellow captives. The girl, driven to madness by weeks of psychological torture, had managed to break free from her restraints during the extraction process, and had caused significant damage to the ritual chamber before being subdued. In the confusion that ensued, with servants rushing to contain the situation, and Elisara focused on salvaging what she could from the disrupted ceremony, Sarah had slipped away from the holding area and made her way toward what she hoped would be freedom. The route she chose led through sections of the castle that had been abandoned for decades, chambers that even Elisara's staff rarely visited. These forgotten spaces were filled with the debris of centuries, rotting tapestries, broken furniture, and the accumulated detritus of lives long since ended. More disturbing still were the signs of previous escape attempts: skeletal remains chained to walls, scratch marks carved into stone by desperate fingernails, and messages etched by dying prisoners that told stories of hope gradually consumed by despair. Sarah's journey through these forgotten passages took her deeper into the castle's history than any living person except Elisara herself had ventured. She discovered chambers that predated the current structure, crypts that contained remains from eras when different kinds of darkness had ruled these lands. Most horrifying of all, she found evidence that Elisara's crimes extended far beyond what even the resistance network within the castle had managed to document. Hidden in the deepest levels of the castle's foundation were storage areas that contained the preserved remains of hundreds of victims, their bodies treated with chemicals that had prevented decomposition while maintaining the grotesque evidence of how they had died. These chambers served as Elisara's private museum of death, a collection of trophies that she could visit whenever she wished to relive her most successful rituals or study the effects of different extraction techniques. The sight of these preserved corpses, arranged like specimens in some hellish laboratory, nearly broke Sarah's resolve and sent her fleeing back toward the relative safety of her cell. But the knowledge that she would soon join these silent witnesses to Elisara's evil gave her the strength to continue forward, following air currents and distant sounds that she hoped would lead her to the outside world. Her escape road eventually brought her to a section of the castle's outer wall, where centuries of weather had weakened the mortar between the massive stones. The gap she found was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and the drop on the far side was a sheer fall of nearly 50 feet to the rocky slopes below. Yet even this desperate gamble seemed preferable to the certain death that awaited her if she remained within Elisara's reach. The fall should have killed her, but a combination of luck and the thick snow that had accumulated on the mountainside allowed her to survive with injuries that were painful but not fatal. She had struck the slope at an angle that sent her tumbling down the mountain rather than impacting directly on the rocks, and the heavy winter clothing she wore provided some protection against the worst of the damage. When she finally came to rest at the bottom of the ravine, Sira was bruised, bloodied, and barely conscious, but she was alive and free. The sound of pursuit from the castle above gave her the motivation to ignore her injuries and begin the treacherous journey down the mountain toward the valley settlements where she might find help and safety. The next 3 days were a nightmare of pain, cold, and constant fear of recapture. Sarah traveled only at night, hiding during daylight hours in caves and abandoned structures while nursing her injuries and trying to maintain enough strength to continue moving. She had no food except what she could forage from the winter landscape, and her water came from melting snow that she gathered in cupped hands. The constant cold and physical exhaustion were almost unbearable, but the memory of what she had witnessed in the castle's depths drove her forward with relentless determination. Her salvation came in the form of a traveling priest named Father Benedict, who discovered her collapsed beside the road leading to Thornwick village. The holy man initially mistook her for a victim of bandits or wild animals, but as she recovered enough to speak coherently, her story began to reveal horrors that challenged his faith in human decency and divine justice. Father Benedict was no naive country cleric. His years of service had exposed him to many forms of human wickedness and suffering. Yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for the tale that Sarah told as she recovered in the village church. Her account of systematic murder, supernatural preservation rituals, and a queen who bathed in the blood of innocence seemed like the ravings of a damaged mind. Yet the physical evidence she bore and the precise details she provided suggested a terrible truth that could not be dismissed. More convincing still were the specific knowledge she possessed about the castle's layout, the names and descriptions of other victims, and the operational details of Elisara's procurement network. These were not the random fantasies of a traumatized mind, but the careful observations of someone who had lived within the heart of the operation and studied it with the attention born of desperate necessity for survival. Father Benedict's initial response was to seek guidance from his superiors in the church hierarchy, but Sira's insistence on the urgency of the situation convinced him that immediate action was required to prevent additional victims from suffering the fate she had barely escaped. He began by documenting her testimony in detail, creating a written record that could serve as evidence for any future investigation. At the same time, he dispatched trusted messengers to contact other religious authorities and government officials who might have the power to act on the information Sira had provided. These communications were sent through channels that had been established for reporting serious crimes and spiritual threats, ensuring that word of Elisara's activities would reach individuals with both the authority and the resources necessary to mount an effective response. The reaction to these reports was initially skeptical, as the accusations seemed too extreme to be credible, and the accused was a figure of considerable political importance, whose enmity could prove dangerous to those who moved against her without sufficient cause. However, the accumulation of evidence from multiple sources, including the intelligence that Sister Agatha's resistance network had been secretly transmitting, began to create a picture that was too consistent and detailed to be fabricated. King Aldwin III, who ruled the realm from his capital city of Drakmor, had been receiving scattered reports about unusual activities in the Drakenvold region for several months before Sarah's escape brought the matter to his direct attention. These earlier reports had described missing persons, strange phenomena surrounding Crimsonmere Castle, and rumors of supernatural occurrences that had been easy to dismiss as local superstition and gossip. The king's own relationship with Queen Elisara was complicated by both political considerations and personal history. She had been a loyal vassal for decades, providing substantial tax revenues and military support when required, while maintaining order in a region that had previously been plagued by banditry and civil unrest. Her legendary beauty and rumored wisdom had made her a valued ornament to his court during the rare occasions when she attended royal functions. Yet there had always been something unsettling about Elisara that the king had attributed to her foreign origins and the isolated nature of her domain. Her ageless appearance had been a source of wonder and speculation, but it had also created a sense of unease that he had never been able to fully articulate. The reports he was now receiving provided a context for those long-suppressed doubts that was both illuminating and deeply disturbing. The decision to launch an official investigation was not made lightly, as it carried significant political risks regardless of what the inquiry might reveal. If the accusations proved false, the king would face the wrath of a powerful vassal who had been unjustly maligned, potentially destabilizing the delicate balance of power that maintained peace within the realm. If the accusations proved true, he would be forced to confront the reality that he had unknowingly harbored a monster within his kingdom for over 2 decades. The investigative team that King Aldwin assembled was led by Sir Marcus Ironhold, a veteran knight whose reputation for both courage and discretion made him ideally suited for such a sensitive mission. Sir Marcus was accompanied by a select group of soldiers, investigators, and clergy who had been chosen for their loyalty and their ability to maintain secrecy until the scope of the situation could be properly assessed. The initial phase of the investigation focused on gathering additional testimony from witnesses who might have knowledge of conditions at Crimsonmere Castle or the activities of its inhabitants. This process revealed a pattern of fear and silence that extended throughout the region, with most residents reluctant to speak openly about their suspicions or experiences related to the castle and its mysterious queen. However, patient questioning and careful promises of protection eventually yielded a substantial body of evidence that corroborated the essential elements of Sarah's testimony. Families came forward to report daughters who had disappeared under circumstances similar to those she had described. Merchants and travelers shared observations of unusual activities around the castle, strange sounds heard during nighttime journeys, and encounters with individuals who matched the descriptions of Elisara's agents. Most significantly, the investigators managed to establish contact with members of Sister Agatha's resistance network, who had been waiting for years for an opportunity to share their accumulated evidence with outside authorities. The documentation they had secretly compiled provided a comprehensive picture of Elisara's operation that was far more detailed and damning than anything the investigators had hoped to discover. As the investigation progressed and the evidence mounted, Sir Marcus found himself confronting the reality that the accusations against Queen Elisara were not only true, but represented only a fraction of the crimes she had committed over the course of her reign. The scale and systematic nature of her activities suggested a level of evil that challenged conventional understanding of human wickedness, requiring responses that went beyond normal legal and military procedures. The final phase of the investigation involved covert reconnaissance of Crimsonmere Castle itself, conducted by specialists who possessed the skills necessary to observe the fortress without being detected. These observations confirmed the existence of the extensive underground chambers that Sarah had described, documented the presence of large numbers of young women who appeared to be held against their will, and identified defensive preparations that suggested Elisara was aware that her activities had attracted unwanted attention. Armed with this comprehensive evidence, Sir Marcus returned to the capital to brief King Aldwin on his findings and receive instructions for the final phase of the operation. The king's response to the investigative report was a mixture of horror, anger, and grim determination that justice be served regardless of the political consequences that might follow. The order for military action against Crimsonmere Castle was issued with the understanding that this would be no ordinary siege or arrest operation. The evidence suggested that they would be confronting not just a criminal but something that had transcended normal human limitations through supernatural means. The force that was assembled reflected this understanding, including not only experienced soldiers but also clergy trained in combating spiritual threats and specialists in dealing with the kind of defensive measures that a creature like Elisara might employ. As preparations for the assault began, word of the impending action began to spread throughout the kingdom despite efforts to maintain secrecy. The story of the Blood Queen and her castle of horrors captured the imagination of common people and nobles alike, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and dread that would make the final confrontation as much a symbolic battle between good and evil as a practical law enforcement operation. The walls that had protected Elisara's secrets for so long were finally beginning to crumble. But the creature within those walls remained dangerous and desperate. The final chapter of her reign of terror was about to begin, and none could predict what horrors she might unleash in her final desperate struggle for survival. The dawn that would mark the end of Elisara's reign of terror broke gray and cold over the Drachenwald Valley, with mist rising from the ancient stones of Crimsonmere Castle, like the souls of the countless victims who had perished within its walls. King Aldwin's forces had surrounded the fortress during the night, moving with the silent precision of hunters closing in on their prey. Yet even as they prepared for the final assault, none among them could fully comprehend the horrors they were about to uncover, or the desperate measures that their quarry would employ in her final hours of freedom. Sir Marcus Ironhold had positioned his men with careful attention to both the castle's defensive capabilities and the supernatural nature of their adversary. The main force was stationed at the primary gates, equipped with siege engines and blessed weapons that had been prepared by the clergy for confronting spiritual evil. Secondary teams had been assigned to seal the various escape routes that the investigation had identified, while specialized units prepared to breach the hidden entrances that led to the underground chambers where the worst of Elisara's crimes had taken place. The assault began at sunrise with a formal demand for surrender, proclaimed by royal herald in the ancient traditions that governed such operations. The message was clear. Queen Elisara was commanded to present herself for judgment on charges of murder, sorcery, and crimes against the natural order. Safe passage was offered to any innocent persons within the castle who wished to depart before military action commenced. The response from within the fortress was a silence so profound that it seemed to carry its own menace. No banners appeared on the battlements, no defenders showed themselves at the walls, no sounds of preparation or defiance echoed from within. The castle appeared as lifeless as a tomb, yet the investigators knew that dozens of victims remained trapped within its depths, along with the creature who had consumed their lives in service of her unholy preservation. As the hours passed without any response to his ultimatum, Sir Marcus gave the order to begin the siege in earnest. The blessed catapults launched their projectiles against the outer walls, while teams of engineers worked to undermine the foundations and create breaches through which the assault troops could enter. Yet even as these conventional tactics proceeded, it became clear that they were facing something far beyond the scope of ordinary warfare. The stones of Crimsonmere seemed to resist their attacks with unnatural tenacity, requiring far more effort to damage than their age and apparent condition should have demanded. Projectiles that should have shattered ancient mortar instead bounced harmlessly away, while the iron tools used by the engineers began to corrode with alarming speed when they made contact with the castle's foundations. It was as if the very structure had been infused with the evil that dwelt within, transforming it into something that existed as much in the spiritual realm as in the physical world. More disturbing still were the phenomena that began to manifest as the siege intensified. Unnatural shadows moved across the castle walls despite the bright daylight, and strange sounds echoed from within, not the cries of battle or preparation, but something that resembled chanting in languages that predated human civilization. The air around the fortress began to take on a reddish tinge that made breathing difficult and caused several soldiers to collapse with symptoms that no military surgeon could explain. It was Father Benedict, the priest who had first heard Sarah Blackthorn's testimony, who recognized the true nature of what they were confronting. The manifestations surrounding the castle were signs that Elisara was attempting to complete some final desperate ritual that would either grant her escape or exact a terrible price from those who dared to challenge her power. Whatever she was doing within those cursed walls, it was drawing upon sources of energy that had been accumulated over decades of systematic murder. The breakthrough came not through the main assault, but through the efforts of the specialized team that had been assigned to infiltrate the hidden passages leading to the underground chambers. Led by a former thief turned royal agent, this group had managed to breach the concealed entrance that Sarah had used in her escape, following the route in reverse to access the heart of Elisara's operation. What they discovered in those subterranean depths would haunt the survivors for the remainder of their lives. The chambers that had been described in the investigation reports were revealed to be only a small portion of a vast complex that extended deep into the mountain bedrock. Room after room contained evidence of systematic torture and murder on a scale that defied comprehension. Surgical instruments designed for extracting life essence, storage areas filled with preserved organs and bodily fluids, and libraries containing knowledge that should have been destroyed centuries ago. Most horrifying of all was the discovery of victims who were still alive, maintained in states of semi-consciousness, while their blood was slowly drained to feed Elisara's daily enhancement rituals. These unfortunate souls had been reduced to little more than living vessels, their minds shattered by months or years of systematic abuse, their bodies sustained only long enough to serve their captors' perverted needs. Among these living corpses, the rescue team found Serafina, the healer's daughter, who had been Elisara's most prized donor. The girl was barely recognizable as human, her body wasted away to almost nothing while apparatus maintained the minimal life functions necessary to keep her blood flowing. Yet when the rescuers spoke to her, something flickered in her eyes that suggested the spark of consciousness still burned within her ruined form. It was Serafina who, in whispered words that barely carried the strength of breath, revealed the location of Elisara's final refuge and the nature of the ritual she was attempting to complete. Deep within the castle's most ancient foundations lay a chamber that predated even the earliest records of the fortress, a natural cave that had been used for dark purposes since before the coming of Christianity to these lands. There, surrounded by the accumulated power of centuries of sacrifice, Elisara was preparing to transform herself into something that would transcend even her current unnatural state. The ritual she was attempting, according to the ancient texts that guided her practices, would consume the life essence of every remaining victim in the castle simultaneously, channeling their combined vitality into a transformation that would make her truly immortal and grant her powers that no earthly force could challenge. The process required careful timing and precise conditions, but if completed successfully, it would make her invulnerable to any conventional attack. Armed with this knowledge, Sir Marcus quickly reorganized his assault to focus on reaching the ancient chamber before Elisara could complete her transformation. The teams that had been working to breach the outer walls were redirected to the underground passages, while the clergy prepared protective rituals designed to shield the attackers from the spiritual corruption that surrounded the ritual site. The race through the castle's depths became a nightmare journey through accumulated centuries of evil. Each level they descended revealed new horrors, chambers filled with the bones of victims whose names had been forgotten, workshops where unspeakable experiments had been conducted, and storage areas containing substances that defied identification but radiated malevolence that could be felt like physical pressure. The sounds of chanting grew louder as they approached their destination, accompanied by other noises that suggested the ritual was nearing its climax. The temperature in the passages began to rise despite the depth underground, and the stone walls themselves began to glow with a reddish light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some massive heartbeat. When the assault team finally reached the ancient chamber, they found themselves confronting a scene that would have challenged the sanity of less determined men. The cavern was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move with independent life. At its center stood a pool carved from the living rock, filled with blood that steamed and bubbled as if heated by fires from the earth's core. Elisara stood waist-deep in this crimson pool, her body glowing with an inner radiance that made her appear more like a demon than a human being. Around the chamber's perimeter were arranged the remaining victims from the castle, each connected to the central pool by channels that carried their life essence to feed the transformation ritual. Most were already dead or dying, their bodies drained of the vitality that their captor required for her final apotheosis. The queen's appearance had been transformed by the power she was channeling, her beauty enhanced beyond anything that could be called natural. Her skin glowed like polished marble lit from within. Her hair flowed around her like liquid shadow, and her eyes burned with fires that seemed to hold the concentrated malice of all the innocents she had murdered. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that suggested she was no longer entirely human. Her words were a mixture of ancient languages and sounds that had never been meant for human throats, but their meaning was clear enough to those who heard them. She was calling upon powers that had slumbered since the world was young, offering the accumulated sacrifice of decades in exchange for transformation into something that would rule over humanity as a goddess of blood and death. The assault on the chamber required tactics that had never been taught in any military academy. Conventional weapons proved useless against a being who had transcended normal physical limitations, while the very air around Elisara seemed to poison those who breathed it too deeply. It was the combined efforts of the clergy present that finally disrupted the ritual, their chanted prayers and blessed implements creating barriers of spiritual force that prevented her from completing the transformation. Yet even as her ritual failed, Elisara's rage and desperation drove her to attempt one final act of vengeance against those who had dared to challenge her dominion. Drawing upon the power she had already absorbed, she began to channel it into a destructive force that would bring down the entire mountain and entomb her enemies along with herself in a massive tomb of stone and earth. The collapse began slowly, with small stones falling from the chamber ceiling and cracks appearing in the walls that had stood unchanged for millennia. But the destruction quickly accelerated as the accumulated spiritual corruption that had taken root in the castle's very foundation was released in a catastrophic discharge of malevolent energy. Sir Marcus recognized that conventional retreat would be impossible given the scale of the destruction that Elisara had unleashed. Instead, he ordered his men to focus their efforts on rescuing as many of the surviving victims as possible, while the clergy worked to contain the spreading collapse through protective rituals and blessed barriers. The final moments of Elisara's existence were a testament to the consuming nature of the evil she had embraced. As the ancient chamber crumbled around her, she stood defiant in her pool of blood, screaming curses in languages that predated human civilization while her stolen beauty began to consume itself in fires of spiritual corruption. The preservation that she had maintained through decades of murder began to unravel all at once, revealing the true cost of her unnatural longevity. Her flesh began to age with supernatural speed, decades of accumulated time claiming her body in moments as her crimes finally demanded their price. The beautiful face that had remained unchanged for 40 years crumbled like ancient parchment, while her hair turned white and fell away in handfuls. Her glowing skin became mottled and diseased, then began to decay as if she had been dead for years. Yet even as her physical form disintegrated, something of Elisara's essence persisted, clinging to the chamber that had been the site of so many of her crimes. Her final screams echoed through the collapsing passages with a quality that suggested they would continue to reverberate through the stones long after all physical sound had faded. The rescue operation managed to save fewer than a dozen of the victims who had been found in the underground chambers, and most of these survivors were so damaged by their experiences that they would never fully recover. Serafina, the healer's daughter who had provided the crucial intelligence about Elisara's final ritual, died in Sir Marcus's arms as they carried her toward the surface. Her last words a whispered prayer of gratitude that her suffering had finally ended. The collapse of Crimsonmere Castle was visible throughout the Drachenwald Valley, with the ancient fortress folding in upon itself in a display of destruction that seemed to exceed the merely physical. When the dust and debris finally settled, nothing remained above ground except a depression in the mountainside filled with rubble that glowed with an eerie light for months afterward. The investigation of the ruins would continue for years, revealing the full scope of Elisara's crimes and providing some measure of justice for the hundreds of victims whose remains were found within the collapsed chambers. The evidence that was recovered would lead to the identification and arrest of many members of her procurement network, though some of the most dangerous individuals managed to escape to other kingdoms where they presumably continued their evil practices. The legend of the Blood Queen would persist long after the last stones of her castle had been cleared away, serving as a warning about the corruption that could result from unchecked vanity and the pursuit of immortality through evil means. The site where Crimsonmere had stood was declared cursed ground by the church, and no structure was ever built there again. As for the valley itself, it slowly began to recover from the spiritual corruption that had poisoned it during Elisara's reign. The crops began to grow again, the wildlife returned, and the streams ran clear for the first time in decades. Yet those who lived through those dark years would never forget the lesson of the Blood Queen: that beauty without virtue is merely a mask for the monster beneath, and that no amount of stolen youth can compensate for a soul that has been surrendered to evil. The tale of Elisara von Drachenwald became a warning whispered by mothers to daughters about the dangers of pride and vanity, while serving as a reminder that even the most powerful evil must eventually face judgment for its crimes. In the end, the queen who had sought eternal beauty through the blood of innocence found only eternal damnation, her name forever associated with the most terrible chapter in the history of the Drachenwald Valley.